Okay, many excuses, of course. 14th of December, welcome to Weekly Marx. And well, today we're going to review lectures 8 and 9. It will be a repeat in one sense. On the other hand, we looked at this before. We've looked at this a month ago, and I had been waiting for the yet to be posted lecture 10 of 9th of December on Marx's dependency theory on rupture, sort of the Marini and Jaffe point of view on that, which is Higginbotham's main sort of work in the background of doing volume 2 of Marx's Capital. Needless to say, this is, I tried to give them all that. They of course put a contingency in saying that it's not guaranteed that what they're going to do, but assuming that he did do it on the 9th, it should have been posted in YouTube at least 4 days later, 5 days later. So therefore they had probably rescheduled, therefore were not released, but I had waited long enough, I suppose. I should have looked earlier. So there is the link and etc. And I put links on this page to lectures 8 and 9. And of course, everyone has forgotten what went on a month ago on 8 and 9. So review is necessary for everybody, including me. I think the most important image from diagram from that set of readings is people who use capital for the theory of imperialism. And as we've been looking at in Lasordo et al., that an anti-imperialist position is probably still important. You can't sort of let it go. And, for those of us in the US, we're in the belly of the beast. So it I think behooves us to sort of understand that we're part of this major history. And if you want to just look at it from an economistic point of view, the American model of industrial production, the extension throughout the world, several world wars, the sort of the basis of globalization, although that's being shifted, and it may shift further if you're if you sort of look at where China is going, et cetera, that the argument between a so-called bipolar or a multipolar point of view, we're sort of on this quasi-anti-imperialist multipolar idea. Actually, that's not quite true in the sense that it's used as a kind of rhetorical device by people in places like Russia and I suppose in China. China doesn't talk about multipolar as much. Right? It's certain parties are talking about multipolar for a variety of different reasons. So it's not always one point of view on what counts as a multipolar or plural view of the global economy or power. But needless to say, if you want to understand multipolar, I think it's important to look at various forms of the models for imperialism, because I think they still apply, even though, there are various people who will make versions of it, problematic versions, Clash of Civilizations, the Eurasian arc or whatever. Each of them have their own sorts of issues, right? Belt and Road, global north-south, all of these things are at work at the same time, and one has to be sort of conversant in whether it's world systems discourse or center periphery. They're all of a piece, and in some ways they exist at different scales, and it is scale, or the scale and scope of capital, that is the actual problem, if you take a kind of David Harvey point of view. And that's actually kind of important. So you can see here that in reviewing, and this is why his doing rupture of dependency theory and Martini and Jaffe is important because they reflect on issues of surplus value, on the things that yes, some of us go back and look at Kautsky for various reasons. This is the big picture is, of course, Lenin wins in this entire little struggle here, but Kautsky's still worth reading. He at least gets to live longer than Lenin. Luxembourg lives longer as well, but not quite so long as we know from history. It The current sort of points of view include and most of what we're building on is, Engels kind of re-editing the 3 volumes of Capital. And yes, it is Marx's writing, but, there's an awful lot of Engels. And Engels is there more particularly in terms of the rise of the sort of diamat or dialectical materialism and a variety of other things, including imperialism at all. But, this is a collective work, and so we're in volume 2 with Higginbottom. I assume he's going to do a volume 3, which is, you sort of have to do volume 3. But the background here, as you can, I think, see, that there's a Marx economic doctrine. It's more of a kind of the economism that some people take on. The imperialism notebooks, which, in terms of Lenin, this is where it all kind of the actually existing socialism is built, however misread by a variety of other folks in the Soviet Union, i.e. Stalin. And it's a continuing struggle. People get purged. There's secret police. There's all kinds of terrible things. But those things are at work. And so reading Lenin is still important in the 21st century, just simply to see that there are components of, for example, Russian policy, foreign policy, but also certain elements of their industrial policy that have been, whatever retained, conditioned, whatever, by the Soviet model, however co-opted by oligarchs. So that's kind of still at work. That's worth having an argument about, certainly. But it still comes together as a kind of, and as we've seen with Africa, like still north-south, even though there's Belt and Road and all that other stuff. The important literature, Grossman kind of reinterpreting Capital, Bukharin, who, he gets purged. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. Hilferding on finance capital. So you can see that at work. And then, of course, people like Emmanuel et al. There is, there's a lot to do here still. And so the key generations that Higginbottom identifies are, of course, the issues of the so-called third world and dependency theory of the 1970s, still at work in at one level. You're not going to say that there's this big singular kind of dependency model. It's more complicated than that. And because of if you assume an uneven development theory, you need to sort of see how that adjusts to it. To note, of course, that imperialism's still at work. We still do that stuff. The initiative in Angola is about building a railroad, but and which is kind of 19th century, right? And it is about raw materials, resources being funneled from the interior of Africa to the port. So we're really back in the 19th century, even though it's sort of one of the last acts and the first visit of Biden to Angola week before last. So all of those things are at work. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about, and this is as a matter of review, since we don't get to see sort of the concluding lecture by Higginbottom. I guess we're going to get it this coming week. So when we see it, unless it comes today, and I'll talk about it tomorrow, next Saturday, probably show part of it and then discuss it, because It'll actually be very interesting. I think this idea of rupture, I think, is very important. Rupture, ideas of rupture go back to, well, the 70s, 60s and 70s, and the, sort of the uh, movement of Western Marxism to sort of talk about how things operate and with a certain kind of certain types of analogies, and they're very important ones. There's no doubt about that, and the literature is actually fairly dense on that subject, and worth discussing, because each of these, a rupture is a kind, we could assert, at least at theoretical level, a kind of crisis, needless to say. And I would hope that people would think that, yes, we're continually challenging the idea of is uh, transformation in all of these processes, is it one of a kind of unidirectional thing, or does it have many directions? Is it, without going to quantum theory or anything, uh, there are a variety of crises going on in the current moment. There are several wars going on. I mean, excluding the big ones, Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine, Russia are the big ones, but there are little ones. They're little just at scale, but they're fairly significant. Stuff going on in Ethiopia, Somalia, Malawi, Mali, some still going on in Nigeria. So stuff's going on, and it's problematic at a variety of levels, and there are a variety of actors that make it even more complicated. And of course, some dimwits want to take away certain types of imperial influences, but essentially all it does is meet the new oligarchs, same as the old oligarchs. So that's kind of what's going on. And you have, if we're rooting, for sides, often I think it's better to go for the people who are, on the one hand, less brutal, on the other hand, still imperialists. So, that's the difficulty of Marxism, the difficulty of communism, to try and say, well, all of this is just part of a process, so that we can get to a point where there's none of this kind of conflict. But that path of rationalization is very problematic, as we know, in terms of the history of Lenin, and the history of Soviet actually existing socialism. So it's still a problem, and difficult to gain a kind of ethical or moral position on it. So that's perhaps why we've retreated to theory, or we spend more time on theory because it's a little easier to work on. On the other hand, it is always praxis. It's always kind of saying, well, we just it can't be perfect now. It may be perfect soon. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but sooner. And we need to think about how we are moving towards that. So the structure of capital has a certain totality. And there are different perspectives on it. And a totality perspective includes these several elements. That is the idea that there's a focus on industrial capital at the front end. If you want to think in terms of totality, that it moves from productive capital, the production relations described in volume 1, which is more important because of all the reasons why there's a new translation, that is to kind of smooth out some of the ideas, and they are significant. I mean, the notes may be more precious for the the Princeton translation, because it catches us up on some of the interpretive things that have happened in the last 30 years since the last English translation. And so it does have as it were, an American point of view in that context. So volume 1 is, productive capital, labor process, production, class relations, accumulation, an attempt to abbreviate some of the issues of volume 2 and volume 3. But you can see with the long vertical arrow here, it is of a whole, that you get a kind of synopsis in volume 1 of volume 2, the process of capital and circulation, how things appear. And then volume 3, you still have some of that. That's what the long arrow is about. Discussion of other things, hinting at, volume 2 and 3. This is a product of the editing process of, Engels and Marx. Marx, starts this, and then Engels sort of finishes it. And then we have, a bunch of interpretations that are problematic. Rubin, Grossman, a whole bunch of folks. And this goes all over the place for nearly a century. And it's you have to sort of ask yourself, well, it's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. It just hints at these ideas. And some of these ideas actually exist. You can see, as the literature points out, not only in terms of the history of the last 150 some odd years, but even in the present, that most of these elements are kind of available to us now. The manifestations are more problematic and more difficult, and make people who commit to only one point of view, let's say a productive capital point of view, kind of at sea when you start thinking about financialization, for example. Financialization is problematic. It makes people, sort of have to critique it, but also say, well, this does have a distance between people who actually earn wages and people who just accumulate profit. And that distance expands, and the original kind of materialist hope that there would be a crisis and then a big change, not quite happening, although some major changes are occurring, and we get hopeful, right? Syria overturns its government in 2 weeks. That's pretty massive, and it's not the only government that overturns itself quickly. You could say that that's happening in the U.S. That's a problematic analogy, and it took 8 years, but it's sort of still moving in a problematic direction. So the productive capital, if you deal with it as a totality, is this a single vertical line. And if you look at another level of this transformation or the path, you look at commodity and money, money to capital. And it's a simple path. You look at the basic equation, CMC, MCM, where P fits, all of those things to get to commodity and money, the money, commodity, and then money, right? And then money to capital, which is the process problematized at every level. The assumption is, I think we looked in previous weeks, the role of money. Money is abstract, but yet it's quite real, since people, treat it as some sort of indicator. But the fact is, money is not identical to capital. Money is not identical to wealth. And, these things actually have, palpable purpose. One of the reasons why it isn't is because of surplus value, because of accumulation, because wealth is not identical to money. Accumulation is not identical to money in that same sense. It has all of these other elements. So one way you get at that is to talk about surplus value, small v, and then big V value. Problematic, of course, because other things come into hand, and they're problematic for many people. Ethical conditions under which you accumulate, and that's kind of where we are now, where people like Musk et al. Can make moral things out of when they're just clearly not qualified to do it. They just simply have a lot of money and a lot of wealth, or at least what appears as wealth. So that's also problematic. Anyway, we learned the difference between absolute and relative surplus value. We learned that it is about class relations, and how rigid the model for class is problematic, right? It's problematic. We've talked about this before, that Americans, for example, don't understand what middle class means, or self-define themselves as members of the middle class, even though they're making 6 figures, 7-figure incomes, and as opposed to 6 or 7 figure accumulation or wealth, which is not identical, right? A lot of people with $1 million homes who really don't make as much money as they would think. And as we saw with the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, you could see how tenuous that is. So we make that as a problem in history. And then, of course, there are numerous appendices that tackle a problem that is kind of resolved in subsequent volumes of Capital. But of course, this is the editing issue about how you talk about the relation of value form to capital form, which are not identical. One is a subcomponent of the other at various moments, but there is, in the theory of circulation, process of capital and circulation, these kind of switch forms at various moments. That's the capital switching argument from the production side, and turnover, which I think is as I've mentioned before, it is kind of the moment of sublation at one level. It is an index of how certain things are valorized. So all of these things come together. Turnover signifies, how is it that we get from profit to surplus value back to profit again? Because it moves. It moves, in differential rates and in relation to an absolute and other kinds of stuff, as we've seen. The importance of absolute is more important for things that we were just talking about in terms of rent, theories of rent and financialization, because it's constantly moving around back and forth or circular in multiple circular paths. So it is about appearance. It appears because of these circuits. There's a sort of aggregated social capital flow. Because there are certain generalizations, there are formations, social formations of people who enter and leave social formations, people who go bankrupt, for example, or people who win the lottery. Lives change. We also know that there's the so-called tragedy of lottery winners, et cetera. And that is, an interesting and amusing narrative, but that's romanticized in a variety of ways, which is interesting to talk about. But this is a question of as to look at these little star things, from the commodity as unity of use value and value to commodity as the contradiction product of labor versus the product of capital. So the labor capital differential, that's kind of what lottery means, sort of in that sense, is that it on the one hand relieves you of the necessity to work for something, but also, as the romanticism or the narrative goes, some people can't handle it, or handle it in problematic, tragic ways, or leave themselves open to other people who will exploit them, etc. The complex set of narratives there, but worth following in sort of real terms, right? There's some people who are lottery winners. I mean, that's a sub-literature, but it would be sort of amusing. How many people wind up on the Love Boat, for example, who are lottery winners? It's just an interesting number, and I don't hear how much or more. It's just an interesting narrative arc for those who can afford to go, on these kinds of stuff. Whether you have the means or whether you were sort of granted the means by random process, like the lottery. Okay, well, that's one way of looking at it. Note, of course, that there is kind of sub flows. There's the class relation, and then social capital as a relation to class, and then transformed into commodities. And then in volume 3, which is still worth yakking about, and I may yak about tomorrow because there's a new piece by Michael Roberts on Brave New Europe talking about volume 3. Profit forms. That is, there is a form, and form doesn't mean like a container for content. It is this sort of set of things, a structure. Form may not be the best word, but it is, of course, a word in the vocabulary of discussion, the value dash form, which is more about structure and is a translation issue, perhaps. This is the kind of Heinrich value form argument. So there's movement and profit form. There's individual surplus value to larger systems of profit. Profit's only a measure, right, of its. If you start measuring these things, particularly at an individual level, you're going to say, well, how much money is it? What currency figure is it worth now? And of course, in a situation where you have crisis, that is a depression, a recession, et cetera, deflation, devaluation, a variety of things happen, and your stuff ain't worth as much. Some people, freak out, do terrible things because of debt credit relations. And yes, that does happen. The formation of the rate of profit. So for Marx, it's just, sort of easier to go, well, I can't start measuring all of these people. It's a big statistical, problem. It's better to think more theoretically about, well, what are the trends or rates of profit at which stuff's being accumulated? And so you see this one measure of it relative to surplus value at a both an individual level and a collective level. So there is a literature, and not as significant as it should be, but one that attempts to measure surplus value. And there's some literature on it. It's not great because it's trying to move the massive sets of global statistics into a point where you could sort of say, oh, okay, here's how much surplus value exists. Now, what does that get you? Doesn't, you have to then do the very tedious work of trying to figure out, well, how much of it is profit? How much of the surplus value is being used for other things? Where is it coming from? Is it a northward one? Is it a southward one? All of those things at a large scale level, but considering it is like the weather in terms of total numbers, variables or whatever, it is like the weather, and you need a supercomputer. And I think we're at the moment where, time on the supercomputer can give us measures of global, surplus value, which would be kind of interesting. It's just not a lot of empirical work being done, but it's being done. So we, have hopes for the future, and if we can point people in that direction, perhaps we'll get this sense of, oh, okay, here's haves, here's have-nots, here's why the rich get richer, here's why the poor get poorer. We can sort of identify that pretty quickly, and from a policy point of view, identify the culprits. You actually can identify culprits. They're culprits. We see hints of them in, like, the Panama Papers, et cetera. You can actually see how it works. And you can see it it's not hidden, although Panama Papers proves that it is hidden. It can be quite obvious, as we can see in the Trump administration, that it, sort of stumbles along stupidly, and we sort of assume that, well, it's just, it can't be that bad. In fact, it is, but, whatever. And we only discover how bad it is once we see crimes being actually prosecuted. This is that whole business during the first Trump administration of sanctions regimes, and how some people got a pass on their sanctions for a variety of personal reasons or individual surplus value reasons. So, for example, Mitch McConnell and the Kentucky aluminum mill. Doesn't stop there. It goes to Oleg, what's his name, and the lifting of aluminum sanctions at the same time. Gee, it happened at the same time as the Eastern Kentucky aluminum mill was announced. Gee, I wonder how that happens. A guy who owns all this aluminum stuff in Russia. Well, anyway. And, mass media did not sort of say, well, there's somehow a connection here. It doesn't look like a conspiracy theory. It really did happen that sanctions dropped on this one guy, and And then you have this movement toward the Eastern aluminum mill. Anyway, so this is that point of trying to figure out where profit is or going to. That's where the supercomputers come in. Systemic dynamic rate of profit, and of course, does it fall? Does it fall naturally? You know, what happens in the real world in its actualization, which is 3B, 3C. So these are the movement from productive capital to commodity capital. That is where it moves around from production to circulation, distribution, all that kind of stuff, which not covered heavily in volume one, but it is more focused on in volume two, because you needed to do all this, well, not necessarily the math, which is always kind of tedious in the Marxian context, but it's important to do it. It's why we need, that's why computers help. And then finally, three is, getting back to money and capital. And it looks, this is the other component. Remember, there were supposed to be six parts to this thing. And as a historical materialist, you want to actually look at the path of it. So what Mitch McConnell does with his aluminum mill, and it's not his, in Eastern Kentucky, is no different than the 19th century. And in fact, the American economy, the American ideology is a kind of 19th century one. I know we get a big argument about that, but some of the same features exist at the current moment that existed in the 19th century. That is nativism, hating immigrants, and, not acknowledging the fundamental thing is that everybody's an immigrant, whether we were, Americans were forced to come here or driven to come here or just desired to come here, all of the different reasons, but we're all here. And we need to sort of see how that all fits together, because it does all fit together. And in two, the idea of commodity capital, circuits, circulation, selling and buying, departments in proportion, as you get further, in models of what capitals, it is the combination of these things. So we identify the separation, and then we bring them together to look at profit, or the difference between profit and surplus value. Surplus value is a means by which we can differentiate surplus value from profit, or profitability, which is an expectation about profit. And so all of those things are at work. And then 3C is where we get to, in terms of trying to hope for whatever volume 4 was supposed to be, or maybe is, are questions of fetishistic class relations, which is kind of the consumer society that, exemplified in one example, or many examples, but one example is post-war American culture. The thing that the Soviets referred to, and some Western Marxists referred to, as cultural imperialism. And that didn't mean that imperialism didn't exist or was only culturalized, or whatever was manifest in culture. But, you could see that consumption drove that towards the future. People, the so-called American dream is, of course, a material one that is a single-sided plot, X amount of fraction of an acre, the house on the plot with a garage. The garage is actually an important sub-literature. Suburbanization and the post-war America is a classic example, although it is preceded by many other forms of suburbanization, actually notably going back to, let's say, England and Holland, or the Netherlands, and just use a couple of examples in the Western context. So those are all there. It's still there. The history is there. It's not made up. It's not revisionist. It just simply is there. And getting a handle on it is very important for a lot of folks. A lot of folks don't think in those ways, even though that's, that is an important feature of that. So Lecture 8 was on accumulation and reproduction on an expanded scale in volume 2. It's looking at the kind of details I think are important in that context. It does, of course, have all that algebra. Sort of, yes, it's kind of tedious. But it is important to look at the sub elements of these. And even though, the math is a little tedious, particularly if you look at Ed George's notes, but it's tedious in the sense that you sort of have to go, oh, okay, this is what the differential should look like and blah, blah, blah. But it allows us to examine how it is that working capital operates, and you need to look at the details. It seems pretty clear that that markets for things are stuff that people need to know about. It's hard to have inventories of eggs, although you do. I mean, if you understand, that there's a liquid egg market and an egg market that, not identical, and and you don't want to get into the weeds on this, but one lasts longer than the other and has actually lower costs. And so there's a whole other way of approaching the problem that is not being done for a variety of profit making reasons. So I just use eggs as an example, since other people are used, the price of eggs is being used in that kind of way. After all, our military does not use actual eggs. I mean, they do, but in general, powdered eggs in the prison system, for example, are one way of making eggs work differently, for example. And that is, in fact, a production-oriented thing. It's the mechanization of egg production. All right. Anyway, so there is the question of how are these things represented? It is about assets flowing, the inventory of raw materials and components, circulating constant capital, which does represent things, particularly when you move to commodity markets. But if you're talking about financial markets, that's sort of another thing. And of course, since Marx focuses more on finished goods, because that's kind of what he knew, he's hanging out with Engels. There's a textile factory there. So you've got to sort of, that's where all of his examples, well, not all of his examples, some of the examples come from. And so, it's fairly, seems pretty obvious to him how this operates. And so he wants to sort of articulate this further, that is, show the different connections. And it is problematic because it has different ways in which it operates. And in the current situation, before we talk here about Best Buy, you can see the difference in, for example, shirt production. Men's shirts are, and I'm sorry to overgeneralize, but the same fancy shirts that you would pay $50 to $100 for are made on the same this is branding and other kinds of specialty items before tailoring or without tailoring. That's because that's a whole nother valorization process. But anyway, the fancier shirts that you can buy at better department stores are made in the same factories as the cheap ones. And, a lot of it is simply labeling, is branding or brand engineering, or however you want to talk about it. And that's the kind of differentiation that we have in, product production and the way in which we ultimately get profit and then surplus value. So, working capital ratios shift, and Higginbottom does a better explanation of this than I can, but part of it is about inventory, receivables, turnover, and this takes time. This is that turnover question. This is why circulation becomes important to Marx, not so important or not important enough to Ricardo at all. And so the details here are lost on Ricardo, although it is why people return to Ricardo, is to try and get it straightened out. Anyway, variable capital and wages, and that it is a complicated relation, of course. The expectation or capacity of labor, as opposed to identifying what counts as variable capital, the worker as variable capital, And so this underlies this human capital problem of how you would want to um, explain the relations in that same way. It is ideological in the sense that, people, uh, uh, management people say, they work as hard as people on the line, and that's a simple division, easily explainable to people in the late 19th century, because there is a actual working class that actually works, that actually puts time in on the line, and management who works probably hard, but is dealing with more mental labor rather than hand labor, and even that division is problematic. Um, so it is classes just happen. They're the aggregate of this idea, but you can see that the projection of this and how it's defined and the critique of it, there is a critique, but you sort of, if you decided, let's say you're working in an American economics department, if you suddenly decide you're going to attack human capital theory, you're going to get in trouble, just because, it just screws up, what you're trying to do. And yes, it is important to do that. And it is problematic in terms of the use and misuse of social capital defined in these ways. Um, and it's there, but not there. It's there because you need some measures of it. And that's kind of why the critique of surplus value at a large scale, at a global scale with supercomputers is going to help sort of work through some of the details. Um, it would get you into trouble if you were trying to do measures of exploitation at the World Bank, but in fact, it would actually help it explain stuff and actually provide ways in which you can see how imperialism operates, because it's still there. And this, the basic ideas of fixed capital and variable capital are still there. I mean, you can dress this up and move it around and to call it human capital, but it's still the same stuff. It just got branded better. Nobel Prizes were involved, and similarly, as it goes further on, this question of human capital gets discussed. It becomes more abstract on the one hand. On the other hand, more liberal ideas about equality and inequality sneak into, if you're using Nobel Prizes as quasi Nobel Prizes as a measure, they come into play, even in the as we saw with Darren Agamo and whatever Asamogalu. He's talking about the same things. He's just trying to do it from a perspective that is kind of intelligible to neoclassical economics, which is good. It's just good. He shows, you can sort of say this. It sort of is intelligible. He uses the tools, the neoclassical tools, and he just says, well, it's still there. Inequality is still there. You still have to work on it. So there's that. I note that I'm coming to the end of my time, or I've exceeded my time, and I'll note that there are, it stuff happens, and accounting measures like depreciation, amortization, earnings before interest and tax, and earnings before interest and tax and depreciation and amortization are all part of these measures that have shifted our ability to think about both tangible and intangible assets. And of course, in a very standard 19th century sort of way, there's this problem that we see now. It is why Trump, in his simple-mindedness, insists on drill, baby, drill. It is because it's incredibly profitable to use a certain type of model to, the write-offs of failed fossil fuel or mineral exploration is a huge amount of how profits occur. And so these can, when he says these can be manipulated, that's where the money's coming. It's why Canada is prosperous, because it bases itself, well, a significant number of mining interests are headquartered in Canada for X number of reasons. And so that's all happening there. It's not about mining in Canada. It's the corporate control of mining. For example, in South Africa, a lot of it goes to Canada and not that we should hate Canada for it. It just simply, it's kind of the way things have gone. And of course they have their own, issues, whatever, tar sands, blah, 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 blah. And then there's stuff on fixed capital. The question is, it's not a regular reproduction, but rather a spiral kind of expansion. And these movements are not one big spring, but many springs that are spiral springs, not, they're like mattress springs in that sense. And yes, there's a whole lecture there. Anyway, so we have the measure in the Marxian sense and hoarding and gold production focusing in this very simple way. And then, of course, when we start talking more about money, we note that, well, tying an economy to gold is problematic and doesn't allow for certain types of growth. And so accumulation is a function of that. There's differences at the level of exchanges between Department 1 and Department 2, and that there is, of course, a Department 1 and Department 2 for workers that are part of this problem, and it gets uglier from an Arab point of view, and yet it just gets uglier. But there is math, it is there, it's provable, and the humanists who talk about this with all due respect, need to understand this better. I think that that's where some social science is very important, is to sort of explain via numbers that while they seem a little complicated, essentially shows that expansion and growth occur. Let's put it that way. Accumulation does happen, and it happens mathematically. And so there are general rules that come from this, and that we know that accumulation is not identical to profit. Ultimately, it has these details and has different paths, we could say, or different ways in which we can talk about value. Value has multiple definitions. There is no one totalized big V. I mean, we can talk in a way that totalizes value as big V value, but really value is an aggregation of multiple paths to value. And surplus value is one way of talking about that ultimately. And it is identified at the front end in volume 1 and just simply built on in volumes 2 and 3. And they're not perfectly linear. They're all kind of a thing connected together because, of course, as I've said before, volume 1 is kind of front-loaded. It's front-loaded for all kinds of reasons. It provides a theoretical basis for talking about, the Communist Manifesto. People who go, well, all that's, revolutionary stuff's okay. And we can sort of say, well, some revolutions don't quite make it and get screwed up. Why is that? Why is it that we can't overthrow, various classes or conflicts or achieve what we need to achieve? And then Marx says, well, I sort of worked out the numbers. This is kind of what you have to do in a material way, but you still need to sort of, motivate people to do stuff. And that's kind of the ideal thing. So his summary is, I think, a good summary, development from volume 1, development within volume 2, and of course there'll be volume 3. This is a specific input-output model of socioeconomic reproduction through circulation. And yes, it can be mathematized even in a much more direct and interesting summary way. But the input-output model, that is using input-output tables and a variety of other things, are things that are developed in an interesting way, problematized, of course, by Stalinism. But, that's kind of where a lot of this, some of the theories work. And yes, the question of equilibrium is going to be a key point that will baffle some Marxists to the point of trying to say, well, we've got to talk to neoclassical economics in a certain way, and maybe the way in which we can do it is via a general equilibrium theory. And yes, you can, but no, you can't. Um, because it's still certain things are always held, sort of constant or excluded or, problematic. And when you get to the empirical work, the math doesn't quite work as well. And, some of it is important because in applied work, you need to sort of actually get some of the numbers to work, or otherwise people will get mad at you or won't give you tenure or whatever. Um, and I think that's where, as I've said, supercomputers will save us, not because it's just a lot of stuff. And I think, that there's an answer in there, and I think it comes better from that side. And you'll note that I haven't said AI in any of this. AI can help, but remember that AI is problematic. It's still GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. There still is a problem in thinking that way. It's better perhaps to think about, well, you have all this data, and you sort of have to deal with it. AI can help us deal with it, but you have to worry about the same problems that have existed in time immemorial for econometrics. And so anyway, and the problem is one of conclusions about crisis and forms. How is it that we can explain this stuff? It's still, and explaining it doesn't necessarily give us a good interpretation of things that happen within, that is, class antagonisms, etc. Now, so there's a literature. It's a good literature. These are kind of important texts. Fine and Sod Philo, Fox as a kind of historical position, Harvey, Heinrich, Mendel, kind of, Rudolsky. All of these are the kind of basis of foundation for yakking about this stuff, including even Ted Schultz. um, anyway. So that's all I have to say. I hope there's some comments or questions or brickbats or interventions.
Yeah. Yeah, it was nice to see that diagram with those people in the times.
Yes.
Um, it reminded me of I guess it was Brett from Gorilla History, or sorry, whatever that other podcast is. He hosted a Proles podcast forum uh, on Stalin. And, I listened to that, and one of the guys was sort of, I called it the Stalin, I don't know, uh, rebrand tour or something like that. Anyways, I was like, I was mentioning this to my friend about, they're sort of rehabilitating, not rehabilitating, but, sort of looking at some of the things Stalin did with maybe a more clear picture instead of this, oh, it's awful, evil kind of stuff. And he was like, uh, you know, check yourself before you wreck yourself on Stalin kind of thing, And yeah, and so I'm just, I'm having trouble, I guess, placing Stalin in, the sort of pantheon of good and evil. It's not really a question, I guess, but the other thing was that diagram that Higginbotham has. All of a sudden, I was like, "Whoa, is that organized in a way to kind of mirror the way capital is organized?" You know, if he didn't, he should have. You know, but then I was like, "Oh, wait a minute. Capital is really what's he's diagramming here," and I was like, "Oh, I'm looking at what capital, all the volumes together there, and aren't I not?" Kind of thing.
Yes, yes, exactly. That's He's trying to do the big model, the big picture model. That's yeah, it's volume one, two, and three. And there's a through line from one, two, and three. You have to sort of read them, not that you have to read them all at once, but maybe you have to sort of see them in context.
Yeah, exactly. That's what really helps me is to see them put in context together in this picture, like, that helps me sort of learn it, the individual details within that picture,
Yeah. I mean, it's, tedious in the sense that you got all these damn numbers and you got to add them all up and stuff like that. Um, I sent, I think it's Kleiman, an email that I wanted to, I wanted to quantify he has a model for this, and I wanted to be able to, put it online and, as an intro thing. And he was a little incredulous about it, but do need to actually, I think there's a way to teach this, for example, like with an Excel spreadsheet, and you can actually get this to work. Well, not that I'm going to do that project now, but somebody should.
All right, yeah, you could sort of diagram it out, and then the value in the total column and show you. Like,
Yeah, I'm just surprised that no one has done this. No uh German with OCD has, because I've assumed there must be one mad German who, I've got these 3 volumes of Capital and all these stupid numbers. Why can't I put this in an Excel spreadsheet and just
yeah,
do it?
yeah,
Because I don't want to do it, but I think there's someone who can, and that would be a boon for teaching it. You go,
yeah,
all right, put your number in here, and oh yeah, that's profit. Oh yeah, that's surplus value, and
yeah.
God.
When people, have wrangled spreadsheets, a lot of people have, so they're kind of familiar with that.
Well, I just think that, a couple of these guys, and they're mainly guys in, the UK who have worked on in the city, they've done this stuff. And I assume they know how to use Excel spreadsheets. And since they have graduate teaching positions in places that now that they've left the city, that they get their army of graduate students out there to do a couple of these simple things. That's all.
Yeah.
It's what I do. Oh, you
Well,
want to do a PhD with me? Well, we have to teach the intro course. Let's do the work on get this spreadsheet to work.
well, I
Uh,
mean, that's half the sort of obstacle here is this perception of socialism slash communism as evil, and things like Stalin contribute to that.
oh, exactly. Yes. That becomes about power as opposed to, actually material stuff, of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't say that, Stalin was right or wrong. I mean, eventually, it works itself out, as it were, in terms of employing the masses, and the masses become, by force, you move all your factories on the other side of the Urals so that the Nazis can't bomb you, and you put a lot of people to work.
Yeah.
They don't make much money, or, whatever. I mean, however you want to talk about what money making is or wages are in the Soviet context, but they win the damn war. That's the most important point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's like a sort of always I don't know, undercounted or whatever
I
aspect
mean,
to it.
they do it in this most awful, brutal, revenge oriented way, you know. I
Hmm.
mean, and technically they didn't start the war, but there's that Ribbentrop, Molotov thing.
Mhm.
It's problematic. It is problematic. I mean, you order your Soviet army to sit outside of Warsaw while the remnants of the Polish home guard or home army try to try to revolt
Get
against the
chewed up.
Nazis.
Yeah.
They get chewed up. There are no tanks. They get screwed ultimately. 20,000 some odd people die. It's
Yeah.
stupid. And the Soviets just sit outside of town, going, Well, there are a lot of right-wing folks in this monarchists or whatever in the nobility types in there, and well, let the Nazis take care of them, and that'll mean that the Communist Party and the post-war era will be stronger.
Some shortcuts were taken. Huh?
Yeah, shortcuts were taken. It's just it's a horrible way to run your stuff, but that's how war operates. Churchill's agreement, the naughty memo or whatever it's called, where he divided up the Balkans with Stalin, pissed off everybody. When sort of decided, oh well, you can have most of Romania and Bulgaria, and we'll take all of Greece.
Like instantly made a bunch of enemies, right?
Well, he wrote it on a napkin or something. Christ's sake. Stupid. But it happened. I mean, just, this is what happened.
History, right? Yeah, that's the history.
I mean, it's stupid because it created this other problem that we had to deal with. Whatever the world had to deal with in during the Clinton administration, right? You have Balkans. The whole Balkan thing goes back to World War II. It's essentially
Right, right.
Stalinism, versus something else, and it's some kind of socialism, and it's all screwed up. And then genocide occurs, and then just other ugliness. It's all stupid.
Yeah, it's like almost predictable.
Oh, indeed. I mean, and it is all still about imperialism ultimately. I mean, if you want to reduce it down to that, and it on the one hand that makes you go, well, I'm going to be an anti-imperialist. On the other hand, you got to be realistic about some of these things. It's just,
Mm.
are you bombing the right people? And is that really a goal,
Yeah. Is bombing what you want to be doing?
Well, yeah, because it's not, I mean, we've gotten better at it, but what counts as better? I mean, it's
Right. Yeah. More
uh,
efficient at killing.
well, and sometimes you make mistakes, and there's still mistakes are still made. People, somebody told
Mm.
you this information, and all they're doing is getting rid of somebody they don't like at their wedding, whatever.
Hmm.
I mean, I think that's peculiarly, sort of heinous, but Machiavellian. But
I was last week, I work at essentially a bank, and so
uh,
every year I have to take this, banker's training, which
uh,
is essentially, everybody at the edge has to look out for the fraud. It's, um, push it on to the employees kind of thing. And anyways,
right.
they threw in this because I'm in California, I have like a special extra sexual harassment course to take because in because in
Darn,
California
darn
they,
Californians.
yeah, right. And then it occurred to me, I was like, I'm kind of, I mean, I'm not right there, but I'm sort of, this course that I'm taking is kind of on this boundary between, the workers and the capitalists, right? It's like HR is sort of, you know, the hand of the whoever owns the company that's saying, uh, you know, do this, but it's like there's this constant tension between workers and capitalists, right?
Oh yeah. Well, you get to see
And
woke up close and personal. I guess that it's wokeism at its best.
yeah, I guess that's what it is, huh? Yeah, but it's like, in that training, there was actually this one little video section that they did that was like about gender, and it was really informative, and the people that were doing it, I could tell were, you know, sort of more aligned with me, but it's like the bank is bringing this training, right? Kind of thing. It was just odd.
Well, it's because they're required to do it. That's the whole deal, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I
To cover
mean,
their ass, right? Yeah.
they wouldn't do it if it's about liability. It's about,
Yeah.
this lawsuit, is not going to cost us as much, whatever.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, you get to ride in the Pinto. That's essentially it,
Yeah, right.
You have to drive safely in your self-driving Pinto, whatever. Anyway, um, yeah, no, that's a good example. I think that's an excellent example. It is about, and you, of course, what would the bank do in a situation where everything was federally deregulated? You wouldn't have to take that extra little course there.
Yeah. Yeah, man. The the shackles would be off. They'd be off to the races, man.
Well, that's what is called and you said that at the front end, it is shifting it down to the employees, and it is that's what cost shifting is.
Right, yeah.
It's a kind of at least at the managerial level, this is a kind of flexible production. You're sort of they're offshoring, morality or ethics,
Right.
whatever.
Yeah. Offshoring it.
Well, I mean, if you treat it like that, for example, every state is actually a nation, and in California, that the fifth largest nation.
That's right,
So
yeah.
that's kind of wherever your headquarters is, that's its relation from center periphery, whatever.
Yeah, and it was interesting in the training. A number of times it sort of pointed out the difference between California and something else. That something else was the federal government.
Oh yeah.
So it's like California's kind of on the par with the whole federal government. We're sort of pushing the envelope in some respects, I guess, you know?
Well, it's a reverse action, actually. The whole business of smog control, for example, was because there were all these damn Japanese cars. So California regulations
Mm.
about cars, force the rest of the country to move forward with
Yeah.
emissions controls.
Yeah, I guess we're sort of forcing the rest of the country forward on transgender stuff too, you know,
Oh
because that
well, maybe not for long, but we'll see. And but
right, yeah.
we'll see. It's just stupid. Can't get too tied up in it because it comes with age. The people have been harassing people about bathrooms for decades.
Right.
I mean, no, seriously. I mean, uh, people who transition in the puberty blocking era, um, people who are transitioning at work would be hassled by HR over bathroom privileges. I
Yeah.
mean, the Nancy Mace thing about bathrooms, it goes back, I don't know, 30, 40 years. It's so anachronistic that it's just, weird or absurd.
Sorry, I have to step away here for a sec.
No, it's okay. I'm waiting for Sarah McBride to punch Nancy Mace in the head, but that's just me. It won't happen. Unless Sarah McBride suddenly gets primaried or something, and probably her last a month of office punches Nancy Mace in the head. I'd like to see. Anyway, yes. Uh, in line here. Let me quit. And I said, I hope people got something out of this. Oh yes, thank you, Kelly. That is the kind of revisionist view of it's why people still worship Stalin. I mean, in Russia, there's a cult of Stalin still. It's there. It is. Let's see what else. What is the rupture? There's certain discourses that you can consider, and it's a problematic discourse, but that there is a rupture between early and late Marx, defined by the recovery of it's one of many ruptures, but things that can be talked about as rupture. But the discovery of the humanist Marx text, Grundriss's emphasis on the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, those are part of a kind of rupture between early and late Marx. what Althusser refers to as the epistemological break. And it's, it's sort of a rhetorical device and problematic for all, because if you make that break, that is, if you talk more about humanist Marx, you're also being anti-Stalinist in the sort of 1956 context, the Khrushchev speech. And it's stupid because actually a lot more stupid things happened after 1956 relative to communism than, before 1956. It doesn't mean that what happened before is better, different, but and in fact, 1956 can be seen as a rupture if you were going to argue that out. I'm not going to do that, but whatever. Thank you for that comment, Kelly, because that's actually, I mean, you actually see that in every argument that you have in a Marxist context. It defines the problem of talking about Trotsky. It defines the problem of thinking about race questions and whatever. There's stuff there, and it's always stupid. It just winds up in stupid sub-sectarian kind of arguments that are amusing, and then people are so committed to it, and it's not like you're supposed to be an anarchist about it, that well, I'll let 1,000 theories contend, but you need to sort of talk about common terms, that is adumbration, that is you need to have a common plane of discourse, and often you can't get there with talking to certain people. Certain people, I have a PhD in the blah 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 blah, and I'm going, well, that still doesn't resolve the question. Your PhD means bullshit in this context. There's a literature, it exists, it's a prominent literature, it's not a marginalized literature, and in fact it's still being resurrected. So just get over it, and let's actually talk about reality. So that's the kind of thing that you have to sort of come to with a sort of subsectarian arguments. Otherwise, you wind up with, how many different Trotskyist parties are there in the world? But I'll ask Gemini about that. How many Trotskyist parties are there in the world?